Mark Elson was the kind of man no one noticed until police found him eating dinner in the same house where his mother, Ruth, lay dead and rotting in her bedroom just down the hall. The neighborhood of Willowbend was the kind of place where the loudest noise most days came from the hum of lawnmowers or the distant bark of a dog. Rows of modest, well-kept houses sat behind white fences and trimmed hedges, and life moved at a slow, predictable pace. On the far end of the street stood a weathered two-story home with peeling paint on the shutters and a front porch that sagged ever so slightly in the middle. It belonged to Ruth Elson, a widow in her late 60s, and her only son, Mark, a man who had grown into adulthood without ever truly leaving his childhood home. People sometimes whispered about him, but not out of malice, more from curiosity. He rarely spoke to anyone, didn't seem to have a job, and could often be seen slipping out late at night to walk to the convenience store. Ruth, on the other hand, had been known for her warm smile, polite conversation, and a passion for her rose garden, which she tended to with almost religious devotion. That was why the change was noticed, even if no one acted on it at first. It started subtly. Ruth's garden began to wither. Petals drooped, weeds crept between the flower beds, and the once bright blooms dulled and died. At first, neighbors assumed she must be feeling unwell, maybe taking a break from her daily gardening routine. Weeks later, no one had seen her outside. The windows of the Elson home stayed shut even on warm days, and the curtains were always drawn, giving the place a closed-off, shadowed appearance. There was something else, something that was harder to ignore. It began as a faint odor, so faint that most people thought they were imagining it. A musty, sour smell that would occasionally drift across the sidewalk near the Elson property. One neighbor blamed the town's garbage truck schedule, while another thought perhaps an animal had died in the bushes. But as days passed, the smell grew stronger, sharper, and more distinct. It clung to the air even after the wind shifted, a lingering presence that made people quicken their pace when walking past. Inside the home, the atmosphere was just as heavy. Though no one from the outside could see it, Mark's life had narrowed to a strange, solitary rhythm. He kept to himself even more than usual, emerging only to collect groceries or make late-night trips for snacks and cigarettes. No music played from the house, no laughter, no sign of normal life. For a place that once smelled of fresh-cut roses and baking bread, it now stood as a silent, sealed-off box. The town of Ashfield wasn't the sort of place where people expected bad things to happen. But in the Elson home, something had already happened, something far darker than the neighbors could imagine. The signs were there for anyone willing to piece them together: the neglected garden, the closed curtains, the unending silence, and that unmistakable smell that hinted at a truth no one wanted to believe. The man who finally decided to speak up was Harold Denton, the local mailman who had been walking the same route for nearly 20 years. He prided himself on knowing the rhythms of each household, the way Mrs. Green always met him at the porch for her gossip magazines, or how the Harris family's mailbox was empty every Wednesday because they worked long hours. Ruth Elson's habits had been just as consistent. She collected her mail every afternoon without fail, sometimes offering Harold a glass of lemonade in the summer. But over the last few weeks, the envelopes had begun to pile up in her box, each one crammed in more tightly than the last. Bills, catalogs, a birthday card, none of them touched. Harold noticed them every day, and with each passing morning, he felt a little more uneasy. On a cool October afternoon, Harold decided to knock on the Elson door. He climbed the creaking porch steps and rapped 3 times, listening for the familiar sound of Ruth's light footsteps. Instead, there was a pause, then the door cracked open just far enough for him to see Mark's face. It was gaunt, with dark shadows beneath his eyes, as though he hadn't slept properly in weeks. His skin was pale, and there was a faint sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the chilly weather. Mark's voice was low, almost forced, as he told Harold his mother was resting and couldn't come to the door. Harold didn't press him, but as the door closed, he caught a whiff of something that made his stomach tighten, a smell that didn't belong in any home. By the time Harold returned to the post office, the uneasy feeling had hardened into something closer to dread. He knew something was wrong, and after a restless night, he made a quiet call to the police station. His concern wasn't brushed aside. The officer on the other end told him they'd send someone to check on Ruth. Two patrol officers arrived at the Elson residence late the next afternoon. From the street, the house looked as it always had worn, but intact. The overgrown garden and drawn curtains seemed harmless enough. When Mark answered the door, his posture was stiff, his eyes darting between the officers. He tried to stand in the doorway, blocking their view inside. The officers explained they were there for a welfare check, insisting they needed to speak with Ruth directly. Mark hesitated, his mouth opening and closing without words, before stepping aside reluctantly. The moment they crossed the threshold, the smell hit them. It was thick, oppressive, and instantly recognizable to anyone who had worked crime scenes before. It clung to the walls and seemed to seep into their clothes as they moved through the dimly lit hallway. One officer asked again where Ruth was. Mark gestured toward the back of the house without a word, his hands trembling slightly. What lay beyond that hallway would shatter the quiet illusion of Willow Bend forever. The two officers moved cautiously down the narrow hallway, their boots creaking against the warped wooden floorboards. The smell intensified with every step, sour and sweet all at once, the unmistakable stench of death. The air was heavy, thick enough to make them swallow hard as they approached the closed door at the end. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that made every sound, every breath, every shift of weight echo in their ears. One officer noticed the small fan on a hallway table, its blades spinning lazily, trying and failing to circulate the foul air. When they reached the door, one officer tried the handle. It turned without resistance, and the hinges gave a long, low groan as it opened. The room inside was dim, with only a sliver of light slipping through the gap in the curtains. The air felt warmer here, almost stagnant, as though it had been sealed off for a long time. Against the far wall stood a bed, neatly made except for the mound beneath the blankets. It was still, too heavy-looking, and the faint outline of a head and shoulders was unmistakable. The closer they stepped, the more the smell became unbearable, making their eyes water. One officer pulled back the edge of the blanket, and the truth revealed itself. Ruth Elson lay there, her skin darkened and waxy, her features barely recognizable. Time had taken its toll. Her body was in an advanced stage of decay, the kind that spoke of weeks passing without disturbance. Her hands were folded neatly across her chest, as if placed that way deliberately. The air in the room seemed to press down on them, making it hard to breathe. The rest of the space was oddly tidy. A small nightstand beside the bed held a glass of water that had evaporated to a cloudy ring at the bottom. A half-finished knitting project sat on a chair in the corner, untouched for who knew how long. Everything about the room suggested an attempt to keep it undisturbed, as if someone had been preserving it in a grim, stagnant state. One officer stepped back into the hallway to radio for backup, while the other scanned the room more closely. There were no signs of forced entry or robbery. No overturned furniture, no shattered glass. Whatever had happened here, it had occurred without chaos, but the unnatural calm only made it feel more disturbing. Mark stood just outside the doorway, watching without expression. His clothes were clean, his hair combed, and yet there was a hollow look in his eyes, as if he had been living in a reality separate from everyone else's. The officers took note of his stillness, the way he didn't flinch or look away from his mother's lifeless form. Outside, the quiet street of Willow Bend remained oblivious. Children played a few houses down. A lawnmower hummed somewhere in the distance. But inside the Elson house, a scene of silent horror had been uncovered, one that would soon draw the entire town's attention. At the station, Mark was placed in a small, windowless interview room, its walls a dull gray that seemed to close in with every passing minute. The smell from the Elson home still lingered faintly on his clothes, though he didn't seem to notice. He sat hunched forward, hands clasped loosely on the table, staring at a fixed point somewhere on the wall. When the officers began their questions, his voice was flat, almost mechanical, as he explained that his mother had passed in her sleep weeks earlier. He claimed he didn't know how to handle the situation and had simply left her where she was. For a while, his story remained steady. He described avoiding her bedroom, keeping the door shut, and turning on a fan in the hallway to help with the smell. He insisted there had been no argument, no violence, just a quiet death in the night. But the officers had already received the preliminary findings from the medical examiner, and the details told a different story. Ruth had suffered a blow to the back of her skull, the kind that would have rendered her unconscious instantly. It was not the kind of injury that could happen naturally. When they confronted him with this information, his eyes flickered, the first sign of any real emotion. He shifted in his chair, pressing his palms against his knees, and avoided their gaze. One officer placed a photograph of the evidence on the table, a heavy iron candlestick, stained and hidden in the attic rafters. The sight of it seemed to drain the last bit of composure from him. His shoulders slumped, and he let out a long, uneven breath. Mark admitted the truth in halting fragments. He said there had been an argument about money, about his lack of work, and about what he called her threats to make changes he couldn't accept. At some point, the shouting turned into a flash of anger. He had grabbed the candlestick from the shelf and struck her once, hard enough to end it. The admission was quiet, almost without inflection, as if he were describing someone else's actions. What followed was harder for the officers to comprehend. Instead of calling for help or attempting to hide the body elsewhere, he chose to go on living as though nothing had happened. He made meals in the kitchen, watched television in the living room, and slept in his own bed while his mother's body lay in hers just down the hall. Days became weeks, and he stopped counting. He claimed he didn't want to lose the house, that contacting the authorities would mean the end of his life as he knew it. The officers wrote down every word, their pens scratching steadily against their notepads. There was no remorse in his tone, no visible sign of grief, only a quiet acceptance that the reality was now unchangeable. Outside the interview room, the case was already being prepared for the prosecutors. Inside, Mark sat unmoving, waiting for whatever came next, as though he'd already resigned himself to it. The trial drew more attention than any case the small courthouse had seen in years. Reporters filled the narrow benches, their cameras waiting outside for glimpses of the man accused of killing his own mother. Residents who had once passed Mark on the sidewalk without a second thought now sat shoulder to shoulder, eager to hear every detail. The prosecution painted a picture of calculated violence, arguing that the attack was not a sudden loss of control but a deliberate act born from resentment and greed. They pointed to the injury on Ruth's skull, the hidden candlestick, and the weeks he spent living with her body as evidence of a cold and self-serving mind. The defense countered with a narrative of mental instability. They spoke of his reclusive lifestyle, his inability to cope with stress, and his alleged detachment from reality. Psychologists testified about untreated depression and possible delusional thinking, suggesting that his actions after the death were the product of a disturbed mind rather than malice. Some jurors appeared to listen with sympathy, but others kept their eyes fixed on Mark, their expressions unreadable. Midway through the trial, a new layer of the story emerged. A representative from a local bank was called to the stand, carrying a manila folder thick with documents. The courtroom grew quiet as she explained that Ruth had been in the process of revising her will. For years, Mark had been her sole beneficiary, inheriting both the house and a modest savings account. But just days before her death, she had signed paperwork removing him entirely and leaving her estate to the Ashfield Animal Shelter. The witness held up the dated forms. Signed in Ruth's careful handwriting, this revelation shifted the atmosphere instantly. The motive became clearer. If Ruth died before the legal changes were finalized with the courts, Mark would remain the beneficiary. The timeline was damning, the jurors' faces hardened, and the defense's portrayal of Mark as simply troubled began to crumble. The image of him quietly eating meals, And watching television in the same house as his mother's rotting corpse now took on a darker, more purposeful light. Throughout it all, Mark sat expressionless at the defense table. He did not flinch when photographs of the bedroom were shown on the overhead projector. He did not lower his gaze when the bank representative described Ruth's final visit to sign the documents. If he felt any emotion, it stayed buried beneath the same blank stare he had worn since the day of his arrest. When the jury returned, the verdict came swiftly, guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 40 years in prison, his words measured and unshaken by the stillness of the man before him. Outside, reporters crowded the steps, broadcasting the outcome to a town still struggling to reconcile the horror that had unfolded in their own backyard. The Elson house stood empty for months before the city ordered it demolished. Neighbors said they were relieved to see it gone, yet some avoided the lot altogether. On warm evenings, when the air was still, a few swore they could catch a faint, sour smell drifting from the place where the house once stood, as if the memory itself refused to fade.